whilst the meeting is being recorded. Okay, great. And I am now going to share the slides with you. So, full screen now. I hope you can all see the main slide. Because I'm on my own today, could somebody just give me a thumbs up that they're seeing the full slide and not presenter view? Apologies for asking. Anybody willing to do that for me, please? Great, thank you, Hattie. That's perfect. Great, okay, so welcome again. This is Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week 2023. Today, Thursday, is Business and Places thematic focus, and this is the Builder in Nature webinar. I'm Dr. Gemma Jerome. I am the Director of Builder in Nature and one of the founders of this new green infrastructure framework, which is for industry and planning specialists to understand what good looks like when it comes to green infrastructure. Some of you today may be aware of Builder in Nature, but interested to find out more. Others may be more generally interested in understanding about high quality green infrastructure. And then there are those who maybe are thinking about applying the Builder in Nature standards and want to get that more technical insight into today. So I'm going to cover off all those bases as far as I can in a fairly short presentation. I'd like to leave enough time for discussion, as that's often where the real gems of insight come from. So moving through to the slides then. This is a key question I'd like us to hold in mind as we're going through today's session. How can high quality green infrastructure support the delivery of cost-effective climate resilient places, and how then are those places delivering benefits to optimize the quality of those places for people, business, and the environment? So it's about delivering placemaking and placekeeping for people and nature, and then thinking about the functions of those natural and semi-natural features that make up the green infrastructure network, and how are they then delivering benefits to people, to the economy, and to the wider environment. And then secondly, there's this, what I feel is a subsidiary question: how can green infrastructure standards and guidance support that delivery of green infrastructure, and therefore support the delivery of infrastructure projects and major development? We're going to talk really at the end of this presentation about the drivers for change and why it is now essential to understand what green infrastructure is, how it works, and how it actually helps to facilitate and accelerate the delivery of development. And inversely, if we don't properly understand green infrastructure, it could actually hinder the successful and economically, financially, in particular, successful delivery of development. So holding those questions in mind as we go through. Let's start with the basics. Green infrastructure, what is it? Let's make sure we're all on the same page. We're all with a level playing field in terms of where we're starting, in terms of understanding the definition, the functions, the benefits of green infrastructure. We at Builder in Nature like to think of green infrastructure as critical infrastructure. For far too long, and I'm glad to say we are turning a corner in this regard across industry and across national and local legislation, we thought of green infrastructure and all of the features that relate to the natural environment as nice to have with regards how they are addressed in the planning system. We also found that even when we had strong policy, it wasn't necessarily being delivered. So we're looking for a better way of understanding what really are the benefits of green infrastructure. So there's some words on the slide there. I'm just going to touch on the key messages. Essentially, the key thing that makes green infrastructure valuable is that it actually describes how nature exists in a network. So all of the features, they don't exist in silo, they're not individual features, they exist as part of a network. And it's that functionality of the network and the multifunctionality of each of those features within the network, which means nature is able to deliver many services that are both instrumental for humans to go about their everyday life. It means that places are safe to live, and it also is about the more than humans. So it's thinking about nature in terms of wildlife, biodiversity, as well as people. So essentially, we're looking to support a range of benefits, and critically, we believe that when it comes to delivering high quality places and high value places, if we start with nature and we understand what the existing assets of that place are and we build on those, that's the highest quality place that we can hope to achieve for all stakeholders concerned. In terms of, you might be thinking, well, what components are you talking about here, Gemma? Green infrastructure is a way of describing the whole gamut of natural and semi-natural features. It's green features and it's blue features. When we talk about green infrastructure at Builder in Nature, we're including the whole whole list, a typology of features. So from the building scale, what might be the micro scale, those features that can fit in and around buildings and even integral to buildings. So you can see in the middle row of images there, you can see a house that has integral features for specific species, examples of swift boxes, bat boxes, bee bricks, etc. And then integral features like green roofs and how we can create habitat, stacking that habitat not just on the ground but as part of our infrastructure and our buildings. And then it's all the way up to the landscape scale. So it's thinking about those blue features like rivers, like canals, and even coastal areas. And green infrastructure is a way of describing all of that. Each of those components may come forward or be maybe foregrounded or backgrounded, depending on the type and scale of development you're working at. But we believe an approach which is holistic and actually defines what good looks like at each of those scales of development can support every type of development you might be working on. So whether it's a small scale or whether you're talking about large infrastructure projects, the same principles that define quality can be applied. And that's essentially where the idea for Builder in Nature began. We wanted a set of high quality standards which could be applied to all development types, all scales of development, and also at all stages of development. So a lot is decided, of course, at that pre-application design stage. What will a place look like? We're talking here about development that has to go through the planning system. So there's a lot of stakeholders and a lot of resource and energy engaged at that point to make sure the places that we are bringing forward through the planning system meet, yes, legislation, yes, planning guidance, but also those wider drivers for change, which may be more localized. So these standards can be applied at that stage, but we also know critically that what happens at the post-planning, basically when the planning approval has been given, and we're talking there about implementation, construction, what happens at that moment is very important in terms of maintaining the quality and functionality of green infrastructure features too. So these same standards, these same principles driving for sustainable outcomes can be applied at that construction stage. And then perhaps most critically of all, we need these same outcomes around well-being, water and wildlife to be sustainable in the long term. So we're also interested in that long-term stewardship of green infrastructure. How do we manage and maintain the estates, the assets that we bring forward through new development, whether it's infrastructure or residential-led development? How do we make sure that those benefits they were originally designed in to deliver continue to be delivered into the long term? And we're seeing now more focus in our legislature around that long term, for example, the 30-year monitoring requirement around biodiversity net gain. So there's a clarity now being given across the board. We need to think long term, and Builder in Nature has that baked into its DNA as well. In terms of those standards being accessible and open source, we're absolutely committed to that. You can use our standards framework. You can go across the website right now and download that and start looking at what those standards are saying. We also have an accreditation. Now, what's really interesting about this is we're starting to see stakeholders and industry partners come forward and say, we want recognition for what we're doing here. We want to be able to show a much wider group of either investors in one direction or customers and beneficiaries in the other direction, that we care about the environment, we care about nature, we care about people's lives and their ability, their capacity to flourish where they live, where they work, and so on. So we developed an accreditation system in order to handhold people through application of those standards, and they can work with a qualified assessor who understands what application of those standards on all types and scale of development looks like, and they with that support and our check, our rubber stamping of that quality of their scheme, can come out with an award, and that tells the story really clearly. So that third party external verification of your development can also bring value, either at that planning process stage or beyond, in terms of the lifetime of a development, keeping that message clear that there is a commitment to deliver high quality green infrastructure to benefit people and wildlife in the long term. Just to touch briefly to give that reassurance about who is saying this is what good looks like. So Builder in Nature is a mission-led organisation, but we do work with external partners who are supporting us in terms of bringing their expertise to the table. So our standards framework is overseen by our standards board, and key green infrastructure experts have fed in and are continuing to feed into what those standards say. The other thing which we are bringing to the table is case studies and those resources that really help people to understand how this, how do we bring this to life? What does this look like in either this particular set of constraints? So if we're talking about a large greenfield site in a more rural constituency, what then does high quality green infrastructure look like? What would our ambition be? What should we be aiming for in terms of responding positively to the climate and ecological emergency? And then going in a different direction, if we are working in a much more constrained site, a very urban, dense urban site, or a regeneration situation, where we have much less resource to play with, there may be a much tighter margins, and we need to think also about existing residents and how they're going to respond to any change. So it's these case studies have been selected to tell the story through those different lenses, that actually we can still have the ambition to deliver high quality green infrastructure, whatever the type and scale of development we're working on, even very small development. And for those who are very engaged right now in the biodiversity net gain agenda, you'll know that there is even a small sites metric coming forward to support the delivery of better spaces for nature, even in those very small sites. So it's the same with Builder in Nature, it's the same with high quality green infrastructure standards. We're here as an industry expert to help you understand what good looks like when it comes to the type of development you're working on. The other thing that's really important to us, and I think it's been a very clear ambition from the start, and it's proven to be an important and guiding principle for us throughout the 8 years of us working in this space, is what good looks like depends on the context of the site you're working on. So rather than setting an arbitrary threshold that everyone has to meet, it's the same threshold for everyone, what we believe is that actually the opportunities and the challenges that are unique to each development project, that sets the bar, that sets the baseline for then what we're looking for in terms of uplift, what we're looking for in terms of being able to tell the story about delivery of quality, and also the outcomes that we're looking for will be driven by the particular stakeholders and beneficiaries, human and wildlife, that we're looking for from that particular project. And we work hand in glove with the design team and the project team to define that, and then determine how we're going to achieve that together. So just to bring some of this a little bit to life, so we're not talking too much in the abstract, I've got a few slides now which bring to life the standards framework. And for those who are more generally interested in green infrastructure, these are the principles which essentially across the board. So when we defined the Builder in Nature standards and the principles that underpin them, we looked very extensively across the UK and outside of the UK at what evidence and was driving our understanding of what makes the difference when it comes to green infrastructure at design, implementation, and long-term management and maintenance. So what's embedded within these standards and within the principles I'm going to touch on now is a very broad and extensive review of both academic literature and industry good practice, as well as pulling in periodically as legislation and policy updates and moves forward, pulling that in as well. So you can be reassured that if you're following these principles, you're following the existing good industry practice that we hope you would be looking to achieve, to be able to say to all of your key stakeholders, we care about environmental social governance, we care about the outcomes we're delivering through our projects. So let's touch on what we're calling the core principles. Builder in Nature, as you saw in the previous slide, has 4 themes. It has the core principles, which is very much the how of green infrastructure, and then it has the 3 W's: well-being, water, wildlife, and that's a summary of the key areas of outcome that we're looking for from green infrastructure. So I'm just, to save time today, I'm just going to touch on the core principles, and then we'll come on at the end of the presentation to pull back and think about those drivers. Where is all of this coming from? So there are these core principles to keep in mind. The first one is that green infrastructure is multifunctional. Now, this feels, to those who don't work in this space day by day, to be maybe a jargon word, and I'm just going to explain what's meant by multifunctional. Essentially, the individual features within a network. So what that means is, if you take your site and you determine a boundary, all of the natural and semi-natural features that exist within that boundary have a relationship to each other. And if we can ensure that there is connectivity between those features, if we can ensure that they are individually high quality, and then we are optimizing the connectivity between them, we're creating what we call a multifunctional network. And the other thing about multifunctionality is, essentially, in the most simplistic way possible, we're talking about individual features actually delivering more than one function. So this image here is from one of our developments that has achieved a Builder in Nature award, and you can see it's the natural and semi-natural features are existing right in and around the built environment. We've got a small pond here, which is part of the sustainable drainage system. It's also creating habitat in and around where people live. It's got an aesthetic function, and then clearly it also creates a sense of place. So we've got 3, 4 and more functions stacking up there and delivering benefits for both the developer in terms of creating a higher value development, the people living there, and then also the wildlife who are utilizing that habitat. And then in terms of water management, it's that additional layer of functionality there too. So hopefully that starts to bring that concept to life. I talked about connectivity, so just to extend that a little bit further, we need our features to be connected, because one of the things we're facing and struggling with is actually that our natural and semi-natural features have become fragmented. They've become isolated within the built environment, and key connectivity has been broken and fragmented across the landscape, and that's one of the reasons we're in an ecological and biodiversity crisis. So we need to reverse that, and a key way to do that, development has a key role to enable us to bring forward those and reverse that fragmentation through natural links in the landscape. And that then also benefits people, because, for example, we need connectivity in order to be able to walk and cycle and move around in the way that wildlife needs connectivity as well. Next, we have a principle around placemaking and understanding that the features that we are protecting and creating, and perhaps enhancing if they exist already, need to help to create a sense of place. So either reflecting the sense of place that already exists or creating a sense of place. So we're thinking here about landscape character, we're thinking about context, and understanding, when we're going through a design process or a redesign process, what are the local environmental priorities already from both a people perspective and a wildlife perspective. And we want to be adding to that through our green infrastructure approach, not detracting. And we also want it to be sustainable and to have a common sense to it. So it's not creating a whole new sense of place that has no reflection to the existing character. We're building on landscape character where it exists. If it's a new development, there's always character from the wider environment we can draw from as well. Next, we have a sense of resilience in terms of, will these features continue to deliver their functions and benefits over time? So how do we therefore meet the challenges that we're facing, in particular around the climate emergency? And how do we do that in a positive way through our approach to green infrastructure? So the focus here is that green infrastructure has a key role to play. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a few slides' time. Responsible management is key. We really need to ensure that anything we create will continue to deliver, will continue to be of a quality that it can deliver over time. So we need to think about mechanisms to support stewardship, to support long-term management and maintenance. We need to think about governance, and we need to think about models to ensure the resources are there to be able to do that. We don't set a prescriptive, we don't prescribe what that is, because what good looks like will again depend on the project. It needs to be proportionate and commensurate to the project, but there are good practice principles we can follow around long-term management, maintenance and stewardship of green infrastructure. And then finally, thinking about the environmental gains, thinking about the wider picture. How can we be environmentally sensitive? How can we think about noise pollution? How can we think about creating tranquility, especially in urban areas? How can we think about air pollution and building green infrastructure in a way that it is addressing all of these key issues, and it has that potential to do that. So in summary, we're thinking about multifunctionality, connectivity, sympathetically placed green infrastructure, resilient to the challenges of the future, in particular climate breakdown, responsible management of assets, and environmental sensitivity. So before I finish and move us through to a discussion, I've got a few slides now that kind of, as I said, pull back and just put some of this into context. Why do we need to be interested in this? Yes, there are those of you on the call who will already be thinking about this and are here today to just substantiate, refine your thinking. But equally, there may be some of you on the call today who are new to this and are thinking, how do I get involved? And how do I secure the buy-in investment of my team, of my partners, and a wider industry force to push this forward? So I just want to give you some collateral there. I want to make sure that people understand this is absolutely in line with the way everything is going locally, nationally, globally. So drivers for change, what can green infrastructure support us with? We have an ecological emergency. Green infrastructure can help you to positively respond to the ecological emergency in these three key ways. Following the mitigation hierarchy, and don't worry if that's a new concept to you. Essentially, we're talking here about protecting what we have as far as possible, protecting all of the existing assets and working with, building around and enhancing those in our approach to land, any changes and development in line with, yes, biodiversity net gain legislation in England, but for those joining from Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, there are equivalent approaches which still talk about net climate resilient gains for nature. So it's the basics really of understanding, working with our colleagues from the ecological sector who understand this intimately. How do we start with what we've got and build on from that, rather than always moving backwards and ending up with losses? We need to also underpin connectivity. So I've talked about that a little bit today. We've got new legislation driving us to do that. We've got nature recovery networks, and local nature recovery strategies are emergent. They're going to give us really clear definitions locally as to what the priorities are in terms of reversing that fragmentation I talked about. Where could development go to actually support the nature recovery network? And then finally, we know, and the evidence is very clear, that the biggest positive impact for nature connection is nature on your doorstep. So we need, as far as possible, to deliver as much of our gains for nature close to where people live. So let's make space for nature is the conclusion there. The next key driver is the climate emergency. Clearly, this is something on all of our minds. We COP27 and COP15 last year brings these two emergencies together. And again, simplifying this as far as possible to be as accessible to as many people as possible, we need to do these three key things. We need to mitigate, and that means reducing the carbon that goes into the atmosphere and using green infrastructure to do that. So one example is the right green feature in the right place can sequester carbon. The right feature in the right place can reduce the impacts of the carbon already in the atmosphere, for example, through urban cooling and reversing that urban heat island effect that we all know is having disastrous consequences for people's health, for infrastructure, and many other very costly impacts that we are seeing now as a consequence of extreme heat. Number two, we need to adapt. Things are already changing. Things have been changing more rapidly, more unpredictably. So we need to respond in that way and be as prepared as possible. So we need, for example, green infrastructure again, the right features, the right scale, in the right place, managed in the right way, can, for example, help with flood resilience, and increasingly we need to be thinking about drought resilience as well. So again, a plea there for sustainable drainage. And then finally, thinking about people being able to make different decisions. So climate and nature positive behaviours. If we want people to walk and cycle more and move away from moving around by car for for short trips, for example, we need to make it attractive. We need to make those safe, green, convenient, active travel routes, and people will then choose that option because it's the most healthy, it's the most fun, it's the most inclusive for all the family. It's about making sure that we understand what the obstacles to people's behaviour change are, and then trying to address those through how we approach our placemaking. So exploring and exploiting the synergies between climate positive and nature positive development, we can do both simultaneously. And then finally, the other piece of the puzzle is public health. We need to be thinking about accessible and high quality green space for everyone, close to where people live. That helps us to address our health and social inequalities. And for example, we can address very serious problems that are very costly for society through provision of green infrastructure. One example is the links between people choosing active travel. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, that actually is reducing people's exposure to air pollution and could potentially at a population level help to reduce childhood asthma. So focusing on outcomes for people and thinking about public health prevention as well as addressing more serious issues, that's another opportunity for green infrastructure. We're coming to a close now, but essentially there's some key messages. The climate emergency and ecological emergency are two sides of the same coin. So green infrastructure can help. There's some examples there which I've already covered, but just to leave you with. And just in terms of the Environment Act and the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, two key big pieces of legislation that have come forward. The Levelling Up and Regeneration Act just got royal assent in October this year, and we know that biodiversity net gain as a key part of the Environment Act is going to be with us at the beginning of next year. We need more, bigger and better spaces for nature. That helps us to address the key drivers of biodiversity net gain, nature recovery network. We need more connected green infrastructure, and we need nature close to where people live, because levelling up and regeneration is also about giving people access to that nature, as well as, of course, allowing for a smoother passage through planning, because we're thinking about green infrastructure. We've talked about SUDS. I'm going to skip that slide. Last two slides. From a climate point of view and carbon, we need also to be thinking about that in terms of ESG. So from a green finance or an environmental social governance point of view, good governance, this is becoming a critical agenda. People are absolutely looking for evidence of how you are going to deliver sustainable and resilient outcomes. So valuing nature-based solutions and what nature can bring in terms of securing our development value, but also the resilience of that development from a very physical, practical, functional point of view is often the best way to save carbon and address particularities around it. It often costs less in the long term to maintain those nature-based solutions than to revisit a very engineering and infrastructure, a heavy infrastructure-led approach. Even small-scale interventions matter. So to repeat two things I've said already, to leave you with these key thoughts. Quality is key. Yes, we need to think about quantity, but sometimes a small quantity of high quality green infrastructure can bring as much benefit to people and wildlife. We need to think about it at every stage, from planning through to the long-term stewardship of estates. And then in terms of context, every site has the potential to make a difference. So in terms of adding ecological and social value, whatever type of scale of development you're working at, a nature positive approach is the best way to respond to the climate emergency, the ecological emergency, and to bring those benefits to people, wildlife, the wider environment and economy. Okay, great. So that is where we're going to stop with the presentation. It was quite a whistle-stop tour. I hope that people could follow me, and I'm now looking to open up the floor to discussion. There are quite a few of you on the call. I can't see any questions in the chat at the moment, but is there anyone feeling brave enough to come forward and ask a question in real time for the benefit of all of us? I've stunned you all into silence. I'm really curious about who might be on the call today. So do we have any local authorities, for example, anybody working from that perspective of looking to build in green infrastructure in terms of what they're asking for from their planning applicants? I've got a question from Wendy relating to local authorities, which I'm really happy to answer, maybe to kick off that part of the discussion. So the response, Wendy's question is, what has the response been from local planning authorities? I'm really pleased to say, Wendy, the response has been very positive. So from the outset, we were really clear that one of the things that we wanted to focus in on in terms of the Build with Nature approach, the standards framework and its application, is supporting local authorities to better define what they're looking for from development. And essentially, local authorities are using the Build with Nature standards to build into their own policy guidance, their own local plan process. Some local authorities are picking up the standards and essentially using the wording of the standards to build their own green infrastructure policies. That's absolutely fine. We encourage that kind of plagiarism. Some local authorities are signposting. A very interesting development recently was planning policy. Wales, the Welsh government brought forward new and refined planning guidance, and they have actually now stipulated that it will be a requirement for local planning authorities in Wales to deliver a green infrastructure statement. And the chapter 6 of the Planning Policy Wales guidance signpost people that in the absence of having a clearly defined green infrastructure approach locally, Build with Nature should be an alternative or a supplement to how local authorities in Wales are approaching green infrastructure. So that's brilliant news in terms of levelling that playing field. So developers, house builders and others bringing forward the benefits for society and people through development in Wales will now have a much clearer baseline to work with. Of course, that builds on other great legislation in Wales, like the Future Generations Act, which has clearly defined the need to bring benefits for all, and the net resilient benefits for biodiversity that has been defined in Wales as well as the approach to SUDS that we're seeing translate through in terms of Schedule 3 in England, and ensuring that we are always, where we can, delivering water management through sustainable drainage systems and nature-based solutions. So yes, we have a range of ways in which local authorities are using the standards. The last example before I move on to the next question is also that local authorities, where they feel there is contested landscape issues, and what I mean by that is if they have a particularly sensitive development where, yes, they need to prioritise delivering new homes, and we know local authorities have very high housing targets set by national government, but there is also high value habitat potentially at stake. We could potentially see a conflict of interest there. So where Build with Nature and more generally an approach to green infrastructure can support that potential conflict is to recognise that if development is delivered in the right way, then actually development could support and contribute benefits to nature, and of course whilst delivering those new houses and that new housing requirement. So some local authorities are choosing to encourage their applicants to go for a Builder in Nature accreditation to support their understanding of how the development is going to deliver those benefits across the board. And that external validation and verification is giving them the reassurance they need. And when I say them, it could be the officers, it could also be the elected members, as well as community groups who are also looking for that reassurance that a development is going to deliver positive and net benefits for nature, as well as for people, as well as delivering essential new homes and new communities and new infrastructure. Okay, I will move to this question. What is the process of applying for a Builder in Nature award? Does it have to be made by an accredited assessor? Great question. Thank you, LA, for bringing that forward. So the process of pursuing a Builder in Nature award, I'll try and keep it as simple as possible because I usually have a slide to support this. Essentially, what you would do if you were interested in pursuing an award is the first thing would be to contact an approved assessor. So as you say, an accredited assessor, somebody who has been through the process of becoming qualified and essentially is licensed to work as a Builder in Nature assessor. They would then be able to support you to understand what requirements would be in place for you, because we have, as you saw earlier, different types of award. We have the design award for those which are at that outline stage of planning, and we have a full award who are further along in the process, maybe reserved matters application, or indeed if you are coming forward with a full detailed application from the beginning, you would start at full, and the full award includes a post-construction check, and then we also have a policy award. So there is some understanding requirements around knowing what type of award you're targeting. So the approved assessor can support you through that process. That then would lead to a decision about whether you are going to pursue a Builder in Nature award. Accreditation is 2 stages. It's assessment plus audit. The assessor is always led by the approved assessor. So the short answer to your question is yes, you have to work with an approved assessor. The assessor would then guide you through the assessment, gather all of the evidence, and let me just say that a good quality planning application or a good quality scheme that's already in use, because you can apply the Builder in Nature award to projects which are already in use in situ, and it could be a retrospective award. So a scheme that's already committed to integrating green infrastructure into its approach, you won't need to do anything different. It's a case of just gathering the evidence which supports and tells the story as to how you've done and why you've done what you've done. That's the role of the assessor, to gather that evidence, to analyse that data, and then tell that story. They then, subject to all 12 standards being met, so for every project you have to meet the 12 standards, because we believe that you can't just pick and choose. You can't just focus on well-being. You can't just focus on water. You can't just focus on wildlife. That said, it allows for projects to have their strengths. So it may be that some projects are particularly strong in well-being, and maybe are weaker in wildlife, but it's up to the assessor to balance the parity across those standards. Without getting too technical, that's the process of the assessment. They would then, subject to compliance with all those 12 standards, they would submit that assessment to Builder in Nature, and then my audit team would review and audit that assessment and make the final decision of a Builder in Nature award being given. There is the potential the outcome is at this time we're not able to award, but because of the iterative process, working with the assessor, then working with the auditor, the majority of projects that come forward do receive an award. And we've got a great list of projects on our website, and it's really worth having a look at those. We also have a register of approved assessors if you'd like to see which assessors are active and working in your geographic area as well. Happy to take any further questions about the accreditation after this call as well. I'm happy for people to link with me on LinkedIn. Thank you, Mashal. And then your question, what obstacles have we faced so far? I think that's your question, Mashal. So what obstacles have we faced so far? I would say that the key obstacles around green infrastructure, maybe there's two key themes here. One is getting people to understand what it is and understand, as I said at the top of my presentation, that this is critical infrastructure. This isn't nice to have. This isn't, as somebody said, and I thought it was quite an eye-catching metaphor, for too long, landscape and the elements of the green infrastructure, as opposed to the built environment and built infrastructure side of the equation when it comes to bringing development forward, is too often seen as the parsley on top of the meal. We are here to promote the idea that actually we're talking here about the key ingredients of the meal. We can't build places that are potentially going to flood or run out of water when we have unpredictable weather and climate patterns. We can't have areas where there's nowhere safe to be outside in extreme heat because there's no shade, and the tolerance of species of and plants that have been included in the development are not resilient enough to withstand over a typical UK year, heavy rainfall and then periods of drought. So we end up with no green infrastructure. So we're talking here about making spaces habitable, as well as beautiful, as the new legislation coming out of DLUC, the Department of Levelling Up and Housing Communities, says. Yes, landscape has always been about aesthetics and beauty, but thank goodness, increasingly, we also understand it's about actually making spaces habitable, resilient, and work functional. So I think one of the key obstacles, it's lessening, but it's still an obstacle, is getting the whole of the built environment sector and industry sectors within that to understand the criticality, the vital message that green infrastructure, nature-based solutions are critical to making places work. And I think the second is that when people do kind of get on board and start thinking, maybe this is something I need to understand, it can sometimes be overwhelming. It can feel like there's so much going on in this space once you open the door and you walk into that community, that we've got biodiversity net gain, we've got SUDS and Schedule 3, we've got the race to net zero and getting net zero ready, we've got decarbonisation, we've got thinking about nature connection and reducing health and social inequalities, we've got participatory design and co-design and ensuring that we make spaces that work for all and include them in that design process. And it can feel like we're being pushed and pulled in lots of different directions. That's also why Building with Nature exists. We've done that work for you. We've thought about all of those agendas and pulled it together into one place. So it's a case of, you don't need to understand all of those agendas intimately. You'll work with your experts, your advisors, your technicians who do understand, but essentially we act as that facilitation point, and we pull in all of those experts in order to understand what good looks like through the lens of your scheme, your project, or your planning policy, or your local plan, whatever your agenda is. So I think it's about reassuring people that green infrastructure, including green and blue features, for us is that that nexus, that central point which pulls together all of those agendas and actually allows development and built environment to work. So if you deliver high quality green infrastructure, you naturally integrate all of those other agendas and meet the requirements of all of those agendas that are both legislation driven by local planning policy guidance, and also are delivering for your environmental social governance commitments, which are now really key to the agenda as well. A few more questions, so I'm going to move on if that's okay. So Nicola, your question, I'm interested in your thoughts on long-term management. What would be the sustainable mechanisms that support lifelong function and benefits? Is it community groups? Is it volunteers? Okay, so in terms of long-term management and maintenance, our standard, which if you've got the standards framework there, or you're going to get it straight after this, go straight to standard 6. So we talk, I've got my standards framework here, of course. We talk about having management arrangements in place, ideally early in the design process. So one of the key obstacles, almost going back to Mashal's question, one of the key obstacles in terms of delivering green infrastructure that works, and not just, I'm not talking here about just working for planning approval, I'm talking about working in real time, is that we focus in too late onto long-term management maintenance. So one of our key pieces of advice is to bring in that discussion as early as possible, because what you design needs to be sustainable in terms of how it will be managed. And if you think about management and maintenance at the design stage, it might change what you actually settle on as a master plan, as a design of your project. So that's something really key. In terms of thinking about those management arrangements, once that design is set, we need to think about how do we approach funding. So having a really clear understanding about what funding requirements a green infrastructure plan will have, and what I mean by that is how many types of habitat, how many types of feature, how specialist are those features, are they in the right place in order to be maintained in an efficient way? Have we put something which requires lots of watering because it's in an area of the site which will continuously be experiencing drought? You know, we're talking here about what can easily happen when people are working in silo, but having that overview, which a green infrastructure, a builder in nature approach would have, avoids those really easily avoidable errors to happen. So funding, we want to be as cost effective and as low as possible, and that is about being low maintenance, having the right features in the right place. But still, it will require funding. So we need to understand where is that funding coming from, and who is responsible for ensuring that funding is continues over time. Governance is key. So who will be making decisions at each stage and into the long term? And it might be technical decisions around who's monitoring those features, which have been signed off as part of the biodiversity net gain audit and will need to be monitored to satisfy those requirements in terms of legal compliance, as well as governance in terms of who's managing and maintaining ROSPA and the security and safety of individual features for people. And then softer issues, where that's where your community groups and your volunteers and your friends groups might come in. Who then is bringing those spaces to life and ensuring those spaces feel like they're belonged to, that they have a sense of animation, that they're being used, and the softer skills around engaging with the community, creating events so people know how to use the space, how to come into the space, and know that they're welcome. All people, all social and cultural groups being thought about in terms of that engagement. So I would say partnership is key. Some of those more technical aspects you will need to work with a qualified professional who understands grounds maintenance. You will also need to most likely work with investors or funders, or at least have a governance structure in place who know how to work with that. Local authority may have a continued role in public realm, but in other types of development, local authority won't have much of a role at all, maybe around biodiversity net gain, but it depends. If it's a habitat banking situation, it would be a different body. So what I would say, Nicola, is start with looking at the detail of standard 6 in our standards framework. That has a good grounding of the key questions you need to be asking, and then I'm really happy to have another more detailed conversation later offline with anyone about any of these issues. But also look at our case studies. I can, if you email me, I'll put my email before I leave the chat today for anyone to use, and I'm happy to send links and case studies where we have achieved a really good approach to stewardship. I've got slides from other types of, but I didn't include those today to give you, I've got a nice set of case studies I can easily send to you. I'll try and finish the last 3 questions in the last 5 minutes. So Caroline is talking about biophilic design. Yes is the answer. It does promote biophilic design. What I would say is there's quite a lot of concepts coming from different disciplinary backgrounds. So I often think that green infrastructure is the way planners talk about nature and its role and its function and its benefits. Economists often talk about natural capital. We have kind of more natural science experts talking about ecosystem services. And then designers and those from the world of arts and even architecture talk about biophilic design. But essentially what we're talking about here is a holistic approach that has nature at the heart of design thinking. Sometimes I have a slide that essentially says green infrastructure is nature as design, and it's about securing those benefits, those health and well-being benefits for people, humans, and more than humans. And that's what I believe biophilic design is about, and I would say it's perfectly commensurate with a green infrastructure approach. Yes. And we did some great work with Planted. We've got a really nice video on YouTube where we talk about biophilic design in the context of building a nature and green infrastructure, and I'm happy to link that through to anyone. I'll again leave my email in the chat for those kind of purposes. So really, oh, actually, Michelle is just thanking me. So one last question from Matthew. How much of an impact do you think ESG will have with regards to green infrastructure involving companies outside of developers or local authorities? I know one non-construction related company that is getting directly involved in biodiversity and creating green spaces habitat, but there is a general drive expectation there to aim for that level of involvement for others. And if so, how would you see business involving themselves in this area in the near future, if not already in the construction industry? Great question, and very detailed, and that helps me to answer it. So I would say this is potentially the biggest driver we've had for many decades for green infrastructure, and for those of us working in this space to promote nature-based solutions. It's one of the biggest and most critical drivers we've had for a very long time, and that's because it's international. It's supra national in that sense. It's not going to change depending who wins the election next time. We're talking here about a shift. So the economy, society, and industry is shifting, where we, all of us, regardless of, like you say, whether we're working in the construction sector or not, will have these requirements and to consider how essentially non-financial disclosures is the arena we're talking about here. And for those who are new to this, I would encourage you to go and look up the Task Force for Nature-related Non-Financial Disclosures and Climate-related Non-Financial Disclosures. There's some brilliant summaries and synopses out there. Essentially, what we're talking about here is, as you say, Matthew, a requirement to be transparent about how your business activities will impact on both the environment and society, and to take into account on a very measurable, so we're talking here, people will need to measure, manage, and audit what impacts their businesses are having, from everything from procurement all the way through to more non-physical services and delivery of how they are engaging with their customers. So I would say that green infrastructure is in a useful space, because when it comes to actually being able to measure, manage, monitor, and therefore audit our impact, we're talking about actually looking at green and blue features in the environment. So it's much easier to actually be able to measure our impact, and it will be a core component of both climate and nature related non-financial disclosures. And hopefully it came across in my slides. We at Building Nature see the climate and nature or ecological emergency as two sides of the same coin. One of the most effective ways to address the climate emergency is through reversing the decline and fragmentation of nature. And there is so many ways that businesses can contribute outside of the planning and development process to that. There are too many examples to give, but essentially it might be about, for example, supporting biodiversity net gain through provision of land. So landowners may be getting involved and they sit outside the construction sector. It might be about supporting community groups who are delivering small pockets of nature in urban areas. And there are many more examples, but I think we have to wrap up now. It's 3 o'clock. And Sean will be, I think, grateful if we could keep to the hour. Thank you for your for staying on the call and listening to the whole presentation. And I hope that the Q&A was also beneficial. You will receive the recording if anybody wants to listen back. I'm just going to, sorry, I said I would add my email in the chat. I'll say it out loud as well, just so everyone who's trying to leave quickly can get it. But essentially, My email is gemma@buildingwithnature.org.uk. And you can, if you don't manage to catch that, you will find buildingwithnature.org.uk. You can contact us, you can get the standards framework there. I'm more than happy to have one-to-one chats, and I'm always keen to hear what you're up to and how we can support you to deliver green infrastructure, or any other questions you might have about how you, as Matthew said, how you're thinking about ESG. Great. Hope you enjoy Green Infrastructure Week as we're coming towards the end of it now, and really hope to meet you at some point too. I'll be at different conferences this autumn, so if you do see me and you recognise me, come and say hi, tell me you were on this webinar, and good luck with everything you're working on. Really, really good to see so many of you here today. Thank you. Bye for now.